and the focus is firmly, of course, on Europe, but more importantly, on the Fed. Now, there are a number of outside economists, including Mohamed El-Erian, that have suggested that the Fed should get on with cutting interest rates, and this is risk perception. Is there too much danger in waiting for too long to cut?
Look, there's a danger from waiting, and there's a danger from making wrong moves. The basic function of the central bank and what the Fed's got to decide is we move to a quite restrictive posture. We raise the rates a great deal in a short period of time, and we've been holding it there. We got to this rate when inflation was over 4%, and inflation's now down close to 2.5%. So if you sit with the rate somewhere while inflation goes down, you're tightening. And the reason that you would want to tighten is if you think you're not on path to 2%. If you're on path to 2%, you've got to take seriously that the U.S. central bank's got a dual mandate. So if employment starts falling apart or the economy begins to weaken, which you've seen some warning signs, you got to balance that off with how much progress you're making on the price front.
So how worried are you about the unemployment rate, but with the jobs slowing down? I
mean, it's still, the unemployment rate is still quite low, but it has been rising. And if you look at quit rates, if you look at the ratio of vacancies to the number of unemployed workers and various conventional measures of the job market, they're cooling, but they're at a level which is still pretty strong. That's kind of what we've been trying to fully sort out. Now, I think if you look at the second half of last year, in the U.S. we had 7 straight months of excellent inflation. We hit a bump in the road in January of this year, but now we've gotten a string of improved inflation readings. If we get more like what we have just seen, to me, that feels like the path to 2%.
But so, at what point would you want to cut rates to make sure that the unemployment number doesn't get worse? I mean, how do you calibrate that?
You need to calibrate that. That's the right way to say it. It's not a formula that says, hey, well, last month this is what happened, therefore let's change the monetary policy. You got to take it in totality. As I say, we've been restrictive. If you look at the real federal funds rate of just interest rate minus inflation, it's as high as it's been in decades. And the only reason that you would want to be that distinctively restrictive is if you think that the inflation is not coming back to 2%. If you get months that are like the second half of last year or like what we've seen now here for a bit of a string, then I feel we're on path to 2%, and you return, if that's returning to normal, the rate structure return to normal too.
So what does your June dot look like? Would you cut?
I don't like tying our hands even partially. So it's going to depend on the data. It depends also on the composition. If you look at inflation, in the Fed's dual mandate, we've been doing great on the employment side, and we have done far less great on the inflation side. But now inflation is coming down, so we got to think about both sides. Within inflation, goods inflation has looked almost back to what it was pre-COVID. Services inflation improving, getting closer. And the thing that's been the toughest puzzle in the U.S. has been why housing inflation hasn't come down. The way they measure the inflation in Europe is different. By the European measure, the U.S. would already be at 2%, but we're still grappling with this housing issue.
But is it fair to, when I'm hearing you speak, is it fair that you would cut then sooner rather than later?
Well, like I say, I don't like tying our hand. We're still going to get a lot of data between now and the next meeting, and certainly between now and the rest of this year. But the question of how restrictive the Fed wants to be, when we're at a pretty historically restrictive position, depends on what happens to inflation. And if you just hold the rates where they are while inflation comes down, you're tightening. And so you should do that by decision, not by default.
When you look at unemployment, so it's around 4% at the moment, if it slows down a little bit more, is there a danger, if it actually rises a bit more, is there a danger that suddenly it kind of gets out of control?
There is a danger. Look, the historical business cycle pattern, as you know, is there's not slow deteriorations. What we have seen so far is very unusual. Usually, as they describe, unemployment goes up like a rocket and comes down like a feather. And so that's on everyone's mind, that there are some warning signs in the job market.
But is this time different, or is this a real concern of yours?
Probably some of both. I mean, I always say job of central bankers to be concerned and worried about everything. So we have to take that seriously. That said, the unemployment rate is still very low by historic terms. The job market is still quite strong. It's just been some warning signs. And as inflation comes down, we got to keep our eye on the other side of the mandate. If you remain restrictive for too long, that's going to be a problem.
I know you don't want to tie your hands into calling a cut or a when, but when the Fed starts cutting, is it going to be a cycle of cuts like we've seen in the past, or is this cycle different?
I mean, it depends what happens with the data. This has been a very unusual business cycle, recovery. Now in the job market, it looks unusual. So I don't like to predict for the next meeting, much less, what would happen in multiple meetings after that. I just think we just have to see what happens.
But do you think the market needs to be guided? I mean, the markets have been all over the place in pricing cuts and then not cuts. I mean, some even looking at possible rate hikes.
Yeah, look, the market does what it does, and the central bank does what it does. And Paul Volcker was my mentor, and he had this phrase: "Our job is to act, and their job is to react, and let's not get the order mixed up." So the market, it's presumption. It's not for the central bank to give guidance to the market. The market is trying to figure it out. They have a tendency to run one way, run the other way, and you've seen that with announcements of the summary of economic projections, for example. If the median dot says there will be 3 cuts last December, they say, well, that must mean 7 cuts, and then that volatility has a way of smoothing itself out as they learn about reality.
So it seems that a lot of the data is also politicized when you look at consumer sentiment. Because we're in an election year in the U.S., is it difficult to take? Are you confident that the consumer sentiment that you're seeing is the correct one? Because
not really. The Fed, the law orders the Fed to look at the actual numbers, employment and stabilization of prices. We've always used consumer sentiment and wanted to check that data because it was a good indicator of consumer spending. And part of call it politicization, whatever you want to call it, this real divergence in the consumer sentiment data is that it's become a horrible predictor of actual spending behavior. So I think that's, at least for me, that's made me a little cautious of concluding too much from what comes out of it.
So what does that mean, that you're putting more emphasis? We have a jobs report on Friday.
Yeah, I put a lot of emphasis on the jobs reports, on for sure all the measures of inflation, both the official measures, and we now have such a wide expanse of private sector information that we can get in real time about prices. And I'm in the Chicago district, it's the heart of the Midwest. We talk to business people, we talk to community leaders. We're trying to get real-time information. I put a lot of weight on that too.